On the 21st of November 1916, His Majesty's hospital ship the Britannic sank in the Aegean Sea following a collision with a mine. While this wasn't considered a war crime, the White Star Line vessel became an innocent victim of a great war. The Britannic's story was a tragic but unknown one, and over a century later, some parts aren't known or have been told. In this documentary, we will be diving deeper into the untold story of the HMHS Britannic, in the words of the people who were there. In 1904, the Harland and Wolff Shipyard began building a construction project involving demolishing a set of old yards and modernizing them with 2 aero gantries, house electric cranes, and 2 large slipways, which replaced 3 smaller ones. Although there was no political attempt, this was a bold move in response to rival shipping companies who had been given money loans from the British government, where they would use them to construct brand new ocean liners. Historian Jake Billingham explains why Harland and Wolff decided to begin this project.
Well, the Olympic-class liners were built in competition with the Cunard line. The Cunard line had come up with a deal with the British government to build the Lusitania and Mauretania, and both they agreed with the British government because the Cunard company were running out of money. They were sort of way behind the competition, and they weren't quite caught up, and they were losing money, so they could not afford to actually officially construct the Lusitania and Mauretania. So they had to approach the British Admiralty, the British government, to basically help pay for them. So they came up with an agreement that they would borrow £2.6 million to help construct the 2 ships. But part of that was there was an agreement that in the event of war, that the Mauretania and Lusitania had to be converted into auxiliary cruisers. The loan was supposed to be paid back at a 2.7% interest rate, and it would be paid back over a 20-year period. But part of the agreement was that the Lusitania and Mauretania had to be built to battleship specification, but they would also be used as passenger ships in peacetime. So because of this, White Star Line needed to answer back because they didn't want to lose their custom to Cunard.
In 1902, the White Star Line was purchased by American financier J.P. Morgan, who then formed the International Mercantile Marine Company, or IMM. This move was to save the White Star Line from bankruptcy, and following the foundation, he and Chairman J. Bruce Ismay would immediately begin working on the ambitious project with the potential to rival the Cunard Line for luxury instead of speed. The vessels they would design would become the Gigantics of the North Atlantic Ocean, and soon the sister ships would become a new set of liners, the Olympic class. As the construction work on the aero gantries continued in the North Yard, Chief Designer Alexander Carlisle, along with the head and design department Thomas Andrews Jr. and his assistant Edward Wilding, started designing the liners by creating a set of blueprints. During the design process, Edward Wilding went undercover and made 2 visits to the John Brown Shipyard in Clydesbank, where he observed the construction process of the Lusitania. He also went aboard the ship during her 6th voyage from Liverpool to New York City to take notes for Carlisle and Andrews. In his report, Wilding described how the weather was moderate and smooth, even though the Lusitania sailed in fresh westerly gales with rough head sea. During the voyage, Wilding detected some vibration emanating from the vessel, but nonetheless, he was quick to assure the passengers that there was no cause for concern. Wilding attributed the slight movements felt in various parts of the ship, including the second-class saloon, to possible instances of entrance doors and windows not being adequately secure. Additionally, he noted that the persistent jarring of these openings was a contributing factor to the perceived severity of the vibration. Interestingly enough, Wilding disclosed that he had not experienced any vibration in his quarters, which is B-73. He also observed some staterooms that were impacted by the vibration, while others remained unaffected. In some of the staterooms, which were paneled with hardwoods, there is a lot of creaking and noise when she is steaming into a head sea. and I should think that this is attributable entirely to the binding of the woodwork, as I remember quite well that we had the same trouble in the Majesty and the Titanic years ago, and only overcame it by putting rubber trips between the panels of the woodwork. Wilding also expressed criticism towards the other features, emphasizing that addressing minor issues require attention and solution. In the dining room of the Regal Suite, there is no heating apparatus at all, and in cold weather, this room would not be nearly warm enough. The water arrangements had not been quite so good as they might. TC's first morning, we could get no cold salt water in the baths, only red hot, and cans of cold water had to be brought. Sometimes the fresh water in the basins in the bathroom and staterooms had been turned off, so that no fresh water had been available. But these, of course, are all matters of detail which can be easily attended to. One peculiar feature about this ship is, and in a way rather unfortunate, that is such a wind as we have, practically due south and strong. The spindrift curling around the stern is caught up by the wind and blown all over the lee decks, from the boat deck down, so that they are ringing yet, obliging passengers sit on the weather side. I have never noticed this in any ship before. It is of course attributable to the great speed. Upon its return to the Harland and Wolff shipyard, Wilding made several modifications to the original designs of the Olympic to ensure that the ship met the company's high standards of luxury and comfort. The changes were made in response to the company's belief that such features were essential for success in the competitive transatlantic travel industry. When Wilding's notes were observed, he, Andrews, and Carlisle began to commission a new trio of ocean liners, which officially began in 1907. It took the men 3 months to commission them. After coming up with various designs, including the infamous Design D, the finals were signed off through a contract letter between White Star and Harland and Wolff on the 31st of July 1908. On the 16th of December 1908, a keel was laid on slipway number 2, and she was given hull number 400, though she would be later named as the RMS Olympic. On the 23rd of March 1909, the keel of the ship hull number 401 was laid on slipway number 3. This keel would transform into the infamous sister ship of the class, the Titanic. The sister ships were built in the period between 18 and 22 months, and by May 1911 the RMS Olympic was making her way from Belfast, Southampton, in preparation for her maiden voyage, while the Titanic had been launched from slipway number 3, where she would be towed to the Thompson dry dock for her final fittings. However, the formal letter of agreement for Hull 33 wasn't signed following the Titanic's launch, and the process of signing it would be delayed by 4 months.
The third ship, they did not want to say for certain that they would build one. They wanted to sort of see how the Olympic, because the Olympic was the first one to be launched, and they wanted to see how she would, behave, and not only behave but also see how popular she was. And as Olympic was very popular when she was on her maiden voyage, the White Star Line decided to actually put pen to paper and actually do the third one. But going back a bit is, to build these 3 ships, they had to reconstruct the whole of Harland and Wolff, at least the shipyard. But they could only build the ships 2 at a time, and then they'd have the little spot for the tender ships, which would be later the traffic and the nomadic. But to build the 2 liners, they could only build 2 at a time, and Britannic would follow on later in Olympic spot.
The letter of agreement was signed in October 1911, though the date remains unknown. The keel for Hull 33, later called the Britannic, was laid in November of 1911 in slipway number 2, where her older sister, the Olympic, was built on. While she was being constructed, the Harland and Wolff shipyard faced a serious tragedy. On the 14th of April 1912, the Britannic's older sister, the RMS Titanic, was sailing on her way to New York City when she collided with an iceberg in the North Atlantic. She would never complete her maiden voyage, as she would founder nearly 3 hours later. The sinking created a huge loss of life for the 1,496 souls that would perish. A few of the lives that were lost were a group of shipyard workers known as the Guarantee Group. This group consists of 10 men who were chosen to accompany the Titanic during her maiden voyage. Sadly, all these men didn't survive, and one of them included Thomas Andrews Jr. The shipyard workers and the design department staff learned the news from the agent company of the White Star Line, Whiting and Tedford. The news likely came to the agents by J. Bruce Ismay, who sent a telegram from the Cunard liner, the RMS Carpathia, the ship that rescued Titanic survivors after the sinking. But despite the disaster, the work didn't stop on the Britannic, and work on the ship continued during the Titanic inquiries. Whiting was called to testify at the British inquiry, where he explained the design and seaworthiness of the ship, which included the double bottom and the engine room.
But what needed to be done to Britannic, and it was Edward Whiting that took charge of the Britannic's construction after Thomas Andrews' death on the Titanic. So to make Britannic safer than Titanic, they had to really go back to the drawing board and find some other ways of trying to prevent another Titanic disaster. So what they did was they had to double hull the ship from the bow up until the engine room. People think that she was fully double hulled. No, she was only double hulled from the bow to the engine room. This was to prevent any repeat of what happened to the Titanic happening to the Britannic. So if she'd come across an iceberg, or she'd come across rocks or anything like that would damage the ship, it wouldn't sink her. And Britannic had to also what was done to Britannic was the bulkheads were raised. At least 5 of the bulkheads were raised up to at least B deck, or as you know, rivet counters would say, the bridge deck. That's, if people understand what the bridge deck is, it's B deck. But only 5, and that was just the forward 5 compartments. And there was an extra bulkhead added to the electric engine room to protect the ship, to give that extra, I wouldn't say unsinkable, but we wouldn't have a repeat.
When she was adjusted, the Britannic had a new inner skin fitted, reduced the size of the middle boiler in boiler room number 5, and additional regular and collapsible lifeboats, taking on a total of 55. Originally, the Britannic was going to be fitted with 8 gantry davits. It was only because of how quickly she was placed into hospital service that only 5 of the original 8 were even fitted. As well as the 5 gantries, 6 Welland and 2 Wayland davits were put on the Britannic's poop deck, a new bulkhead in the electric engineering room, 5 bulkheads extended from E to B deck, and an increasingly number of watertight compartments.
And the Britannic could flood up to 6 compartments. That was another design that was changed. Because with the Titanic and the Olympics, they could flood up to only 4 compartments. Whereas what they wanted to do with Britannic was give her that extra, safety feature, was by adding where she could flood up to 6, and there'd be no trouble. She'd be completely safe. But Britannic wasn't the only ship to have this done, or at least to have these alterations made. The Olympic was also the same. The Olympic had to be double hulled, and she also had to have her bulkheads raised. Because what they found with Titanic was that when she started to flood, there was no stopping the water from flooding from one compartment to the next, because there was no, as the British Board of Trade found, was that the British Board of Trade said that there was no watertight deck to stop water from flowing from one compartment to the next. So they just wanted to make sure that, what happened to Titanic wouldn't happen again. Keep the ship safe.
In 1915, Whiting testified at the limitation liability hearings, where he was asked questions about the size comparisons between the Titanic and the Britannic. In the answer to these questions, Whiting confessed that comparing the 2 liners, the White Star Line referring to the owners at the time of the Titanic disaster, made deliberate points of refraining that the Britannic is a little larger, but not much.
And the other thing that needed to be done, or at least what the idea was, they needed more an efficient way to get people off a vessel that was sinking. Because what they found with Titanic is the 20 lifeboats that she had, they had to float 2 of them off. They didn't have time with the 2 hours and 40 minutes that they had. They didn't have time to float them all off. To get them all off, shall I say, sorry, to lower them. But they had to float 2 of them off, and that was because of the way the 2 collapsible boats were put on the ship was stowed on the ship. They were stowed on the officers' quarters, and the only way you could get those boats off was you had to push them off. You couldn't, grab a davit and then have it wind out the boat, and it was nothing like that. You had to throw them off, and that's what they found they had to do. So with Britannic, what they decided to do was put big crane arms, like on the ship, and they were called gantry davits or girder davits. But to add these to the ship had to be strengthened and stiffened in certain places, in 8 different places. There's supposed to be 8 different gantry davits on the ship.
In 1914, the Britannic was nearing completion and in preparation for her launch. Shipwrights removed the shores, bilge blocks, and keel blocks before placing a wooden cradle that would support the bows of the Britannic. On the 26th of February, shipwrights split the white and blue blocks out and worked on their way from the stern to the bow, completing the task before the rising water could catch up to the slipway. These final stages would have been observed by head foreman shipwright Robert Keith, who was responsible for leading the shipwrights team, and he was the man who previously launched the Olympic and Titanic. At 11:20 a.m., after seeing 2 signal rockets in the air, 15 minutes before the event, and witnessed by thousands of people, Keith depressed the lever inside an ample room to which allows the launching triggers to drop and open a second valve which operated the hydraulic ramps that were connected to the sliding ways. The 2 piles of heavy drag chains and 6 massive anchors, still attached to the Britannic's hull and while positioned in the riverbed, came to a standstill. The 25,000-ton passenger ship hit the waters of the Victoria Channel in a total of 81 seconds. The event had been captured on camera, and in this footage we can see the Britannic sliding gracefully into the water. Despite the damp and overcast February skies, 50,000 people attended the launch, and the occasion was marked by residents and the men who built the Britannic who witnessed the ship from the banks of the channel. The general atmosphere was one of joy, with warm and sincere congratulations to owners and builders. In response, the Shipbuilders magazine stated these words, "In the new Britannic we see, both in design and construction, as perfect a specimen of man's creative power as it is possible to conceive." Hopefully, this time they had got it right. Following the launch, the Britannic had been towed to the Abercorn Basin, where she was pulled by the Harland and Wolff shipyard tugs, the Herculaneum, the Huskisson, the Hornby, the Alexandra, and the Hercules. This was where she was to have final fittings, and just like her older sisters had before her. A team of tradesmen began work on the Britannic, but rather than the usual progress time it would take to fit out a liner, which would usually be 7 months, the White Star Line was in financial trouble for their own Harland and Wolff with 585,000 British sterling pounds. The company were unable to pay Harland and Wolff for the Britannic's fittings. As a result, the Britannic was left for a year with no work being carried out. It's not known when or how the IMM paid back Harland and Wolff, but somehow work officially began around the spring of 1914, and when work resumed, the White Star Line, the company who owned the Britannic, announced that the ship would begin her maiden voyage in the spring of 1915. However, the Britannic would never get a chance to sail on the transatlantic shipping lane. On the 28th of June 1914, an assassination of the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary took place in Bosnia. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand brought shaky grounds that would spark a political conflict between alliances, and this didn't take long before a world war was set alight. In August of 1914, England declared war on Germany and World War I officially began. Following the outbreak, the British government would call on shipping companies to secure vessels, withdraw them from service, and requisition them into either troop or hospital ships. However, the Britannic and the Olympic were placed in secure holdings at Belfast.
Every company was affected by the war. Every shipping company was affected, and some ships would be laid up in dock, some ships would be converted. But what the British government wanted, what they didn't want to do was touch passenger ships, because it costs them a lot of money to convert a ship ready for war service. But part of this problem, and what they found, was that they were very expensive, because they would consume up to 1,000 tons a day of coal, which was very expensive. So the British government had to be careful where they were putting the money and where they were spending the money, because there wasn't a lot of it.
However, a set of events were about to change when, in April 1915, the Allied invasion of Gallipoli allowed larger liners to be requisitioned into military and hospital ships, particularly for trips to the Mediterranean.
The thing is Britannic could not be ignored, although she was huge, and it would be expensive to convert her into any military service. And it just wasn't just the Britannic, also the Olympic was also converted into a troop ship. But you see, because of how big the Britannic was and the amount of space that she had, she just could not be ignored. So what they did is the White Star Line owed a lot of money to Harland and Wolff. They owed at least £585,000. And what they wanted, and so they approached the White Star Line and said, okay, can we use your ship? Because casualties were arising. And this was way before the days of, you know, air travel. The only way you can get people from country to country was through the ocean, by sea. So the Britannic was so big and she had so much space that they could actually use her as a hospital ship to transport wounded soldiers from wherever to England. So they approached White Star Line and said, okay, we've got this agreement. We will help you complete the Britannic. We'll help you pay to complete her, but also we will pay to have her converted into a hospital ship. So they did. So they converted her into a hospital ship. This was around the 13th of November, 1915, when they requisitioned her, and she was converted into a hospital ship. And because bearing in mind, before this, she was laid up for at least 6 months, still painted in grey from the day she was launched. So almost, just over half a year. And it's crazy to think that she was that long, and that long in satin grey, and only little bits were done. So the construction of Britannic was slowed down because they owed this money. So the British government helped finish her off to complete her, but also use her for their own services. And part of the agreement was that they would pay £75,000 to the White Star Line for the use of Britannic, and they would also pay for the running cost of the Britannic.
Not long after, work on the Britannic resumed, but only this time her furnishings that were supposed to be on board were stored. However, it's understood they were in Belfast, where they were planning to remain until the war's end. Before she would turn into a hospital ship, the British Admiralty agreed to pay for the Britannic's completion for 75,000 British pounds to the White Star Line. Once they finished with the Britannic's hospital service, they would pay for the running costs. When she turned into a hospital ship, the Britannic had made changes. This included her first-class dining room converted to operating theaters and main wards. Her B deck was turned into accommodations for offices for medical officers, doctors, and nurses. By the time the fixtures and new fittings were complete, she would be installed with 3,309 bunk beds, 125 electric lights, additional Welland and girder davits, and lifeboats, including one collapsible and motorboats. She was repainted into the hospital ship colors with yellow funnels, white paint, and with a green band along the hull and 3 red crosses on each side, given the number G608. She also would have been given the traditional plumbing, electrics, and galleys. By the time she was finished, she was ready to be handed over to the British Red Cross, and on the 8th of December 1915, the Britannic would begin her sea trials in the Belfast Slough and into the Irish Sea. Although there are no surviving records of the trials, she completed them in a single day. When she sailed to Liverpool soon after, she would be commanded by Captain Joseph Ransom for her delivery trip. But when it came to her maiden voyage, the White Star Line had one captain in mind, Captain Herbert James Haddock. Captain Haddock had been working with the White Star Line since 1888, and he is remembered for becoming the captain of the RMS Titanic during her delivery trip in April 1912 and attempting to come to the rescue on board her sister ship, the Olympic, during her sinking. He is a very respectable captain and had a reputation for working hard and his positive enthusiasm around people. When the war broke out, Haddock commanded the Olympic and was put in charge of a dummy fleet of merchant ships stationed at Belfast. In 1915, Haddock almost captained the Britannic when the head of the International Mercantile Marine Company, Harold Sanderson, tried to reassign Haddock to the Britannic, but the Admiralty refused Sanderson's request. In the end, the Britannic would be commanded by Captain Charles Alfred Bartlett. On Tuesday, the 22nd of December 1915 at 11 a.m., the Britannic would begin her maiden voyage from the Gladstone dock in Liverpool and would start her maiden voyage to Lemnos as a hospital ship. However, at 11 a.m., while sailing off the Isle of Wight, an ill omen would occur when the Britannic pulled out into the Mersey, only to promptly drop anchor and remain strangely immobile. It's not known what caused this incident, but it led to the Britannic standing still. Britannic wouldn't be the first ship to experience the first brush of near disaster, as her two elder sisters had experienced their incidents with the Olympic, who was actually involved in a collision with a naval cruiser, the HMS Hawk, and the Titanic, who almost collided with two ships in Southampton, leaving for her maiden voyage. Nobody was hurt during this incident, however. Another problem occurred when 200 RMAC orderlies had still not arrived from Aldershot and were not liable to be on board for another 12 hours. To pass the time, after settling into cabin 51, a two-berth stateroom that he has to share with Lieutenant Anderson, Dr. Harold Goodman, one of the 1,000 crew members on board, would spend the rest of the day going over the ship. In fact, Britannic was a vessel of such colossal size it was to be time well spent because the missing orderlies would not finally arrive on board until midnight. 20 minutes later on the 23rd, the order was given to raise anchor as the fully illuminated Britannic finally headed westward into the Irish Sea. While the rest of the medical officers were settling into their quarters and getting familiar with their surroundings, nurses and doctors would have likely begun training and making preparations before transporting patients to their final destination. 39-year-old Dr. Goodman would record the maiden voyage in his diary, and on the pages we would write the events that would occur, as these would include the weather, water leaks in the porthole, back pressure from a faulty valve in the ship's tank, and the staff not being informed on when the Britannic was sailing to. The medical staff thought that the vessel was to travel to Australia, but however, this destination proved to be a rumor. She would have a lipo drill in Cape de Gata near the African coast. By Christmas and New Year's, Britannic would collect wounded soldiers in Naples, Lemnos, and Montrose. In her maiden voyage, she would have collected around 3,330 troops. Sadly, during one voyage, one patient died on board after contracting tuberculosis. Private Arthur Ho of the Essex Regiment lost the fight to the disease in 1916, and following his death, he would be buried in the East Montrose Military Cemetery. On the 9th of January 1916, the Britannic would arrive safely in Southampton before she would spend 4 weeks on the Isle of Wight as a floating hospital. Little did everyone know that the Britannic would spend her first and only Christmas at sea, and soon destiny would seal her fate and cause an uproar with German conflict. In the next episode, we will be looking into the Britannic's voyages before she met her fate in the Aegean Sea.